Sea has left no mark on the oceans of the world. No visible monuments, no battle ruins. Yet control of the sea has been the dominant military reality for the past 400 years. Sir Walter Raleigh, at the time of Elizabeth I of England, explained why. Whosoever commands the sea commands trade. Whosoever commands the trade of the world commands the riches of the world, and consequently, the world itself. The story of sea power is the story of ships and the men who sailed them, and those ashore who built them, propelled by a vision that linked the military and economic potential of the sea. It is also the story of a small island on the northern fringe of Europe, where 4 centuries ago the number of people who spoke English numbered less than 3 million. The spread of their language and the political and economic influence they would come to wield was a direct result of their unique and historic relationship to the sea.
If one talks about, say, the rise of the West in a particular historical circumstance, from around 1500 to the present day, then to tell that story without putting the sea and control of the sea at the center of the explanation would be a historical absurdity.
The English nationality was created by the sea. The Angles and Saxons had sailed from Germany, the Danes from across the North Sea, and the Normans, descendants of the Vikings, from France across the Channel. As the poet Tennyson had written of the English, Saxon, Norman, and Dane are we.
The great advantage of sea power, of course, is mobility. Until the modern world, with its railways and hard surface highways, the easiest way to move people and things is by water routes. And so if you actually have that ability to move quickly by sea and in small boats like the Vikings to move up river systems, you have the element of surprise over everybody.
The Vikings would not be remembered as invaders, but as the raiders, plunderers, and the first people to strike terror over a whole continent by their use of sea power. Almost by accident, they had created one of the finest assault craft ever devised. Their longships, measuring between 50 to 100 feet, were rowed by warrior oarsmen seated side by side, sometimes numbering as many as 100. The ship's overlapping board construction made them strong enough for the turbulent waters of the North Atlantic. Their shallow draft allowed them to penetrate rivers, to raid and pillage as far inland as water would take them. The Vikings, as Norse, Danes, and Normans, would settle in Scotland, England, Ireland, northern France, Iceland, Greenland, and for a time in North America. They would attack Constantinople and raid deep into Russia, to Moscow and Kiev, where they became the Rus, the first Russians. But effective as the Viking longship was in projecting Viking power against foreign shores, it was no use in trade since there was little room or protection for cargo. For all its success, the longship was a transitional technology. It would be replaced in the 1300s by the much more serviceable cog.
The North Sea round ship, which we call the cog or the cogger, which was really rather inelegant, not long-ranged, used for carrying bulk transport, for example, the Hanseatic staple goods of timber and herring and grain. Taking that, grafting onto it some new sorts of sail which had been borrowed rather from Mediterranean sailing structures. The coming together of the improvement in the solidity of construction of the ships, putting the cannon on the ships and giving them greater and more flexible sailing range is something that has no genius. There's no Leonardo da Vinci, so far as we know, who put it all together. It was an evolution over time.
The cog kept only the longship's strong overlapping planks, now nailed to a frame of heavy hardwood that included a keel. Attached to the keel was a series of oak ribs. The cog was bigger, heavier, and more seaworthy than the longship. It had a rudder and a flat stern and carried a larger sail. Most importantly, it had a large cargo hold and space to shelter a crew. In time, the overlapping construction, now unnecessary because of the strength of the frame, was replaced. Smooth planking called caravel from the Mediterranean was substituted. It created less resistance and allowed for more advanced and efficient sail configurations. The cog became the caravel, the ship that would create the age of exploration. The Nina, the ship that brought Columbus back from America, and the Matthew that took Cabot back from Newfoundland were both caravels. But what had been sacrificed from the Viking days was the ability to penetrate rivers and to land on almost any coast. The cog and caravels required harbors.
Technology evolving was clearly the contribution of hundreds of shipwrights and gunsmiths, but here we get in Portugal in the second half of the 15th century a leader, Henry the Navigator, who consolidates resources and gives them to the encouragement of exploration at sea and sends them out. And again, he supports this set of exploration and conquest voyages over decades, and there is payoff. It's no coincidence, therefore, that the first European to break into the Indian Ocean, coming round Cape of Good Hope, is Vasco da Gama, and that he is on a mission supported by the Portuguese state for commercial reasons, for crusading and religious reasons, for reasons of glory, for reasons of increase of knowledge. The motives need to be married to the technology, and they need to be organized by the nation state. And here we have in Portugal, under Henry the Navigator, one of the first examples of a new West European nation state with a single-minded ruler.
The initiatives and ambitions of another Henry, Henry VIII of England, are still visible but bathed in a mist of chemicals. One whole side of the Mary Rose, the pride of Henry's fleet, was recently raised from the mud off Portsmouth Harbor, where it had spent the last 4 centuries. When Henry VIII decided England should have a navy, it was not to join Spain and Portugal in exploring the world or to trade, but because he wanted to dominate what were then called the Narrow Seas, the English Channel.
Well, Henry has some unique problems with the continent as a result of his break with the church. And the moat which defends Britain, of course, England at this period, is the English Channel. The great advantage that Henry had, of course, when he dissolves the monasteries is he runs into a great pile of cash. And so that little surfeit of cash that he bumps into allows an English monarch for the first time to build a standing navy of some substance that hangs around for quite some time.
To signal his serious intentions, Henry built the Mary Rose early in the 16th century. It was England's first true warship, a weapon in itself. It was a carrack, which evolved from the caravel to accommodate a new phenomenon: war at sea. It had multiple cannons to assist in boarding and capture of enemy ships. To repel such attacks, castles were constructed at either end, providing its defenders with the naval equivalent of high ground.
The Mary Rose was built between 1510 and 1512 and served very well in the 4 French wars. She was basically a very, very successful warship. The armament of the Mary Rose is really interesting because it combines both the fairly old-fashioned technology of stave-built wrought iron guns, which are basically the barrel of the gun and then fitting the back with a breech chamber with a sealed plug at the end. And then the cast bronze muzzle loaders, which is a technology that Henry VIII had to import from the continent because we didn't in England have that technology. So he brought the best gun founders from Europe and set them to work in London and basically taught English gun founders bronze gun founding technology, and muzzle loading gun was therefore within the fleet and incorporated. She sank doing battle with the French just outside Portsmouth Harbor some 35 years after she was built and launched.
Gunpowder had come from the Orient in the 14th century and had quickly been put to use as a weapon of war.
It's important to distinguish between proper navies as they are established in the latter part of the 17th century and the navies that exist sort of prior to the 1600. Up until about the middle part of the 1600s, navies are a composition of commercial vessels and some royal warships, purpose-built for war, but very often used in peacetime for commercial purposes. If it's a large ship and it carries guns, it can be either a commercial vessel or a warship, depending on what you're using it for. Either way, it costs a lot of money to maintain a warship. It's not a profitable enterprise. You have to pay for people, you have to pay for cannons, you have to pay for food, you have to pay for gunpowder. So it is inherently an expensive business to begin with. And while you've taken these ships up from trade, the people who had been using them are actually losing money very often because the large ships are no longer engaged in that kind of trade. It can be a very precarious kind of business to do this in the 1500s and 1600s.
The fate of the Mary Rose illustrates how precarious.
She fired at least 3 guns from her starboard side and was turning to bring the port side guns to bear, dipped her perhaps newly built gun ports too close to the water, and sank on her starboard side with the loss of all 415, with the exception of perhaps 35 crew on board.
These early battles between the French and the English, such as the one in which the Mary Rose was sunk, were political and military sideshows. Control of the sea as it then existed lay elsewhere, with Portugal and Spain. In 1494, Pope Alexander IV had divided the world's oceans between them.
The Pope's decision to divide the world between the Spanish and the Portuguese really was an attempt to resolve spheres of influence. The 2 great maritime powers at the latter part of the 15th century were Spain and Portugal. And they were both building quite significant empires. The Portuguese had managed to find their way to India, around Africa, through the Indian Ocean, and it ended up in Indonesia, and were working their way around to China. And the Spanish, who had seen that this area was already being exploited by the Portuguese, decided to go due west, and of course bumped into North America. Eventually, when Philip becomes King of Portugal, Portugal is joined to Spain, the Spanish, Philip, owned it all.
Philip was described by the Earl of Essex as the greatest monarch on earth who was strong enough to wage war on all the world united. The the Spanish conquistadors were exploiting the riches of the New World and sending them home to Spain. But there was no law of the sea to protect their ships from capture, and where there was no law, criminality was hard to establish. Piracy or privateering became commonplace, often authorized by the highest authority.
Well, privateering is an interesting business. It really speaks to the absence of some kind of system of regulation and law at sea. That's its origins initially. Law on land, people understood if you committed a crime within the realm of the King of France, there was a system for redress. There was no system for restoring losses at sea. Practice came to be that you could actually receive a letter of marque from your sovereign which would empower you to seek restitution from the subjects of the state from which the perpetrators of the original crime had come. If you organized this well enough, of course, you had all the cost attendant to settling your claim. So you may have to be a privateer for a long, long time, because every time you set out on a privateering expedition, you had to get a ship, you had to pay men, you had to need powder, you needed guns. You could write all those costs off against whatever you captured. It's a way of waging war on the enemy. It's a kind of private enterprise war. If you don't have a large fleet, one of the things that you can do is to simply empower your own subjects to wage war on the enemy's commerce. And it becomes a form of war for, if you like, fun and profit.
It was a way of funneling Protestant anger so that it wasn't turned inwards into a civil war as was happening in France. It was something that the Queen benefited from in a pecuniary sense, though she could always deny to the Spanish ambassador that the English government had a hand in whatever Francis Drake was up to. So this was warfare on the cheap, with a profit, and one which allowed you to escape political responsibility. What's more, those privateers and their ships could, in the event of war, be recruited into the so-called Royal Navy, and therefore augmented by 100, 150, 200%.
Money that Drake brought back was enough for the Queen to use some of it, just a part of it, to repay the national debt. And the balance of the money was really the seed money, if you like, for the start of what became the empire, the English Empire.
Philip of Spain had no shortage of grievances against England, whose privateers in the service of Elizabeth had pillaged his convoys and raided his seaports. But he conceived the Armada as a great religious crusade designed to restore the Catholic faith to England. It would also soundly punish his heretic half-sister-in-law Elizabeth, who had made an alliance with the Dutch Protestants, who were in revolt against Philip's rule.
The alliance between the Dutch and the English was first started on the 20th of August 1585 by the Treaty of Nonsuch. This treaty, in this treaty it was stipulated that the Queen Elizabeth I of England would support the Dutch revolt against the Spanish with 4,000 soldiers, 400 horses, 600,000 florins per year, and in return the English would get the command over the cities of Flushing, Brill, just south of Rotterdam, and the fortress near Rammekens as strongholds within the United Provinces.
Assembling and provisioning the Armada was an unprecedented challenge. Ships of 7 distinct and specialized types were included. Among its numerous guns were 243 of the largest guns afloat, plus 30,000 men, 2/3 of them soldiers. It went on for a year, with all of its details well known to the English, who did their best to interfere. In a daring action, Drake sailed right into Cadiz harbor and burnt 24 of Philip's ships.
Drake's raid on Cadiz in 1587, I mean, literally sails into the major port of the Spanish fleet and stays there for about 2 days. Just ransacking the place. And everything the Spanish send after him, they're able to beat away. And then finally, after they've kind of sated themselves and had enough of trashing the locals and burning ships and capturing ships, and they just quietly sail away. And all the Spanish can do is to sit on the shoreline and sort of wave their fist in frustration and fume at the English.
Despite its formidable size, 137 ships, the Armada was conceived to land an army in England, not to fight a battle at sea. Philip's plan for the fleet was to sail north through the Channel to the Dutch coast, where the ships would pick up the bulk of the army that would invade England. The troops were commanded by the Duke of Parma. The Spanish ships formed up in close battle order for their passage along the English coast. They sailed at an estimated speed of 2 miles per hour. Significantly, the formation mimicked that used by the Spanish army on land, 2 wings of 28 galleons, each protecting the rest of the Armada. The 64 English ships, outnumbered by more than 2 to 1, were divided into 2 loose squadrons, one led by Howard, the Lord High Admiral, and the other by Drake. The English had positioned themselves upwind of the Armada. They had faster ships and attacked both wings from behind, one after another, closing with the Spanish and firing broadsides as they passed. The maneuver was possible because the English had modified the carrack shape, replacing the high forecastle bow with the lower bow of a galley, making it possible to fire forward. Shipboard artillery was still primitive, but their privateering experience had given the English an advantage. They could fire their cannon once or twice an hour, the Spanish once or twice a day.
Archaeological experience has shown the Spaniards built these ships with these huge cannons almost for nothing. When you look at the contents of the Spanish Armada ships and compare this to the contents of the ships that were employed by the English put out many more rounds of shot than the Spaniards did. Cannonballs did not always fit the muzzle of the cannon. Absolutely astounding features that, of course, would be absolutely out of the question nowadays, were done in those days, 1588.
But fire from a distance with the cannon technology of the Elizabethan era did not cause great damage. On the first day, only 2 Spanish ships were seriously damaged, and one of those by a collision with another Spanish ship. The Armada remained in good order during its 6-day sail down the Channel. The Spanish had a lot of experience in sailing in convoy, and the English knew well the dangers of fighting them at close quarters, and so they stayed well beyond grappling range. Lord Howard was criticized in England for what some mistook for cowardly tactics, but Sir Walter Raleigh spoke eloquently in his defense.
The Spanish had an army aboard them, and he had not. They had more ships than he had, and of higher building and charging, so that if he had tangled with these great and powerful vessels, he would have greatly endangered this kingdom of England. Sir Walter Raleigh.
The Duke of Medina Sidonia, over his own protests, was appointed commander of the Armada. He succeeded a much more experienced admiral, the Marquis de Santa Cruz, who died during the long preparations.
The enemy has resolutely avoided coming to close quarters with our ships, although I've tried my hardest to make him do so. I have given him so many opportunities to induce one of his ships to grapple and begin to fight, but all to no purpose, for his ships are light and mine are very heavy. Duke of Medina Sidonia.
Despite being under almost constant bombardment by the English, the Armada arrived in good order off Calais. Its troop ships stood ready to receive the invasion army, assembled on land under the command of the Duke of Parma. But the army could not be transported to the waiting ships because a Dutch navy known as the Sea Beggars, with ships of shallow draft, blocked the way.
The Spanish army in Flanders is the army that's supposed to do the invasion. And there's no real good way to coordinate this in the 16th century. And the wheels fall off fairly quickly. Parma is not able to winkle his way out of the Scheldt estuary. He's not able to break the blockade. He doesn't have the boats available. And because the water is fairly shallow there, the fleet that Philip sends in is simply too deep in draft to lift the blockade and get him out.
As the Armada waited, exposed in tidal waters off Calais, the British attacked with 8 fireships designed to scatter the fleet.
It certainly dispersed the Spanish fleet. You know, there were a lot of accidents happening at the time. The people just cut their anchor cables. Ships were running aground or slashed into each other. In my opinion, regardless from all the other events that took place, with the ships that got grounded and the storms that chased them, it was the fire ship attack on the 8th of August.
The Armada regrouped in the North Sea, and then the Duke of Medina Sidonia, its inexperienced commander, made a fateful decision. To avoid turning south into an adverse wind and renewed attacks by the English fleet in the Channel, he ordered the fleet to continue to sail northward across the top of Scotland and down the west coast of Ireland.
There never was anything that pleased me better than seeing the enemy flee with a southerly wind northward. Sir Francis Drake.
The threat of the Armada was decisively ended. England had not lost a single ship and less than 100 men. Plagued by severe gales, 25 Spanish ships were sunk. Others foundered in the open sea or were wrecked on the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. Spaniards who survived the wrecks and were able to get ashore were killed by the local inhabitants. Fewer than half the Spanish ships would reach home, but the hardest blow was to Spanish prestige.
This was a very, very significant morale blow. It wasn't so significant in terms of Philip's capacity to try it again. We often forget that there were 2 further Armada attempts of an invasion of England in the 1580s and 1590s. He could put the pieces back together again. Such were his resources. But the morale blow across Europe captures the sense that this had become a pan-European religious and sectarian conflict. This was known about from Gibraltar to Stettin in the Baltic in a very short order of time. It really reinforces the Protestant cause in the Netherlands and in France in particular.
The damage was also real. The sea was no longer a Spanish possession as the Pope had decreed. It has been revealed to be a common area in which all powers can contend for supremacy, an area which will confer decisive military and commercial advantage on whoever can control it.
In some extent, the weakness evident in Spanish sea power and in the decline of Spain as a great power towards the end of the 1500s and through the 1600s provides an opening for those rather ambitious northern powers to get on the sea and actually begin to take that Spanish and Portuguese empire apart. And they do that.
The age of exploration was about to give way to colonization. In this new opportunity for land, an English cleric saw God's hand. In 1609, the Reverend Simon Purchas described America as a sort of icebox, its treasures preserved by God until Christians could claim them.
A virgin land unwrongfully usurped by wild beasts and Indians, unreasonable creatures. God, in his wisdom, has enriched the savage countries that those riches be attractive to Christians. Simon Purchas.
England's growing power at sea came to be based on the great numbers of merchant ships built to supply a two-way trade with the colonies. But as a merchant carrier, England had a rival closer to home, the Dutch, her former ally. Antwerp, not London, had become the shipping terminus of Europe, and the Dutch merchant marine had become the common carrier of the world.
It's estimated that about half of all the world's trade goes through the port of Antwerp. All the world's trade combined, about half of it goes through that single low-country port. So the Dutch have this enormous chokehold on Indian trade. They've broken into the old Portuguese system in the Far East. They made an enormous amount of wealth out of it, carrying that trade back to England. They're beginning to stick their fingers into Spanish trade in the West Indies and into Brazil. They're certainly involved in the trade along the African coast. And the English, at this stage, are still pretty much a North Sea fishery, local woolen trade back and forth across the North Sea kind of people. And they look across the English Channel and see this enormous wealth in Holland, and they decide they want a piece of it. But the wars are ultimately about control of that trade.
The Dutch had rapidly adapted the faster and more seaworthy English galleon design for their ships. The Batavia was built in 1628 as a Dutch East Indiaman. At 45 meters long, she was one of the biggest ships of her time. Armed, she became a warship, which she frequently needed to be to protect her valuable cargoes from pirates. When England was making its first step toward colonization in the New World, the Dutch matched their efforts, establishing the strategically important colony of New Amsterdam on the island of Manhattan on the Hudson River, a gateway to the interior of the continent.
The downside for the Dutch is that there really is only one way home. You got to come up the channel. You can go north about, but it's more laborious and much more dangerous. And so the Dutch have to fight. And the English know they have to fight. And so those Anglo-Dutch wars of the 1650s, 1660s, 1670s are uniquely brutal and intense in their fighting in many cases. There's no plan B. The English are sitting like a cork in the bottle, and the Dutch have to keep the bottle open, and the English know that.
These were very, very much trade wars. In the words of the great English historian Colin Wilson, C.N. Wilson, profit and power go hand in hand. And it's very evident that the English see this. There are English admirals who say, you know, what we are out now to do is to break the power of the Dutch so we can get their trade, so we can destroy their monopoly of trade.
The growing rivalry between the two former allies, Holland and England, spurred an arms race in warships. Charles I of England opted for prestige as well as effectiveness.
Sovereign of the Seas is looked upon now by historians as not the sort of prototype ship of the line, but more as a good early 17th century prestige warship, something which a king could then display to foreign dignitaries and heads of state. It was enormously costly. I think the figure is 74,000 pounds sterling, which would be the equivalent today of about 3 American nuclear aircraft carriers in terms of actual cost, billions and billions of dollars.
To meet the huge expenditure, Charles created a shipbuilding tax and made it applicable to inland towns as well as seaports. The outcry over this ship money helped convey to the English the importance of a navy, but also helped to cause a civil war.
The irony, of course, is that Charles ultimately falls out with Parliament over the issue of who he can tax and for what purpose. Parliament eventually wins the Civil War. Charles loses his head, and then, like most good politicians, they extend taxation for the fleet to the inland counties and build a huge fleet, which Charles could never have afforded to build because, of course, they've looted all the royal treasury and confiscated the royal property. So you can build yet another great fleet based on this easy money.
The new parliamentary navy and the new ruler, Lord Protector of Britain Oliver Cromwell, shared a belief in professionalism scorned by the aristocratic naval officers who had fled or been killed during the Puritan Revolution. Cromwell achieved this reform by appointing generals to command the navy.
What's happening in land warfare in the middle part of the 1600s is that land warfare is becoming linear. They're moving away from dense phalanxes of men, from the old Spanish tercio, which is a big square phalanx, into linear formations which achieve their objective on the battlefield on the basis of firepower. Concurrent development at sea, of course, is that ships begin to line up stem to stern and achieve their decision, or try to achieve their decision, by using firepower delivered from linear formations.
The Anglo-Dutch wars are significant in the story of the development of the organization of standing navies, because both the Dutch on the one hand and then the English under Cromwell's protectorate and then later on under Charles II with his wonderful administrator Samuel Pepys, the English create what the Dutch have created, which is a standing board of admiralty, a control system, a set of rules, including disciplinary rules, but also rules for engagement at sea.
Watching a 4-day battle between the English and the Dutch, a French observer was profoundly impressed by the English ship discipline.
Nothing equals the beautiful order of the English at sea. Never was a line drawn so straight as that formed by their ships. They fight like a line of cavalry.
By 1680, you have a standing professional navy under the discipline of the Articles of War, paid for through Parliament by taxes, and you have sea power with a vengeance. It's probably not surprising that when the great American historian of sea power, Alfred Thayer Mahan, sat down to write his seminal work, The Influence of Sea Power upon History, it's dated 1660 to 1783. Why does he choose 1660? It's the Anglo-Dutch Wars, but it's also the beginning of organized admiralties.
The great diarist Samuel Pepys, who was clerk of the Navy Board, quotes an English captain: "The trade of the world is too little for the two of us. Soon one must go down." Pepys added,
Public matters are all in a hurry about a Dutch war. Our preparations great, our provocations against them great. And after all our presumption, we are now afeard as much of them as we lately condemned them.
There's a brief period in the early 1650s when the Dutch and English are talking about actually forming a union, but they would become one country. And failing to do that, the English kind of said, well, if you won't join our country, then we'll have a war with you and we'll take some of your trade.
The competing commercial interests of the English and Dutch, which included the slave trade, made war between the two almost inevitable. In 1651, Parliament passed a Navigation Act, which forbade trade to and from England and her colonies in any but English ships. The Dutch correctly interpreted this as a provocation.
Dutch-English wars, I think, are fascinating because they are probably the most purely commercial wars ever waged in the history of sea power.
First Anglo-Dutch War, 1652-1654, was quite clear, as far as I can see it, that there was an overwhelming superiority on the British side. The British ships were much, much larger, bigger, heavier, with larger guns. It wasn't a fair match between the British and the Dutch. And the mere fact that there were still some victories made by the Dutch, I think, is quite an accomplishment on their part.
When the uneasy peace was broken for the Second Shopkeepers' War, 15 years after the first, the French became allies of the Dutch.
The Dutch certainly had some time between 1654 and 1665 to recover from the blows that they had received during the First War. They had built some larger ships too, some 84 gunners or 82 gunners.
The Dutch Admiral de Ruyter's brilliant tactics during a 4-day battle resulted in 20 English ships destroyed, against a handful of his own. An admiring Louis XIV of France gave him this medal. The boldness of the Dutch admirals was not confined to the open seas. They attacked the British fleet at anchor in a daring raid on its base on the Medway River.
The Dutch raid on the Medway is a fascinating account of all the kind of contemporary problems of sea power. There's a kind of a bun fight going on between Charles II and Parliament. And the appropriations for the fleet don't come early enough for the fleet to mobilize. Yes, they're at war with the Dutch, but they can't basically get the fleet out of the Medway because they haven't got the appropriations.
The daring raid was the worst defeat ever inflicted on the Royal Navy, at a time both for tides and wind when the best pilot in Chatham would not have undertaken it. Samuel Pepys.
There was no need for such hit-and-run strategies in North America. When the English captured New Amsterdam, they decided to keep it, changing its name to New York, and in one stroke took control of the entire American East Coast, from Nova Scotia to Virginia. The Netherlands' Achilles' heel was geography. Unlike the island nation of Britain, the Netherlands had vulnerable continental borders and aggressive neighbors.
1672 in Dutch historiography is the year of disaster. The Prussians were standing on the border, the French were standing on the border too, the British were fighting the Dutch ships at sea, and this small little republic of maybe 1 million, maybe 1.5 million inhabitants tried to keep head above water, literally.
The Dutch fear of Louis XIV and France, and the British fear that James, their new king, would restore Catholicism, prompted the English Parliament to offer the Dutch Prince William of Orange and his English wife Mary the English throne, thus linking the world's chief maritime powers. William arrived with 20,000 soldiers.
In many ways, one of the most decisive acts ever undertaken by the Royal Navy was not to stop the Dutch fleet that carried William. They could have done that. And it's the ultimate betrayal, if you like, of the sovereign after whom the Royal Navy is named, because James gets the boot, William is installed, and the Royal Navy basically stays in port. And that solidifies the power of British Parliament, which is the moneyed class, the trading class. And so the Navy, ironically, the Royal Navy really belongs to Parliament at a time when it reaches its zenith. It's not the King's Navy at all. It belongs to the moneyed class of Britain.
And by getting that trade and monopolizing that trade, you get the wherewithal in terms of resources to pay for your navy. And so if you can manage it, as the English do in 6 out of the 7 great coalition wars of the late 17th century through to 1815, if you can get the recipe right, you are on a winner. And the other remark I'd make about the Anglo-Dutch wars is that the Dutch were a formidable opponent, repeatedly so, and some of the battles of the Anglo-Dutch wars were among the bloodiest in naval history.
When we look at the Navy, it was quite clear, certainly after the Glorious Revolution, after William III went over to England and have enjoyed a good time with Mary there, in this role as being the King of England and the King of the Netherlands, he certainly stressed that the British Navy should, or the English Navy, should develop itself quite firmly, and the Dutch Navy should not. It was a very clear policy.
The Dutch maintained commercial access to the oceans of the world, protected by the British Navy. As for the English, it was the beginning of an empire that would owe its very existence to sea power.
The only state that's really putting money into maintaining and developing and actually fostering a standing navy on a large scale at the end of the 1600s, after the collapse of the French Navy early in the 1690s, is England, is Britain. But there's still a very important Dutch fleet. There's still a significant French fleet. All of that trade, increasingly through the 18th century, continues to travel, if you like, under English or British sufferance.
Britain's next challenge would come from France. The fighting would take place in North America and India, far from what Europeans considered the center of power, and even more remote from the consciousness of the people of Africa and the Orient, who were just beginning to become aware of the forces and the people that would forever change their world.